In the late 60s and early 70s of the 20th century, Julio Cortázar published two of his most theoretical texts, Important About the Story, the articles some aspects about the story in the Cuadernos Hispanoamericanos magazine, and of the short story and its surroundings in his last year's literary collage. These texts are regarded by the Academy and generally by the tales contemporaries like two fundamental contributions to the understanding of the genre. Julio Cortázar offered us a very personal vision on the genre, story, as well as a methodological proposal based on its own creative experience. Want to find out what Julio Cortázar's creative method for writing stories was? Cortázar, born in 1940, was a writer and translator. Translator, he worked for UNESCO and some publishers. He became a French citizen in 1981 as a protest against military dictatorship from his country, which chased and banned him even after he had self-exiled himself in Paris. Innovators of their time. Is a master of the story, the poetic prose, and the short narration in general. Although he wrote everything, essay, theater, literary criticism, his fame transcends, especially as a Juventus fan, although he also wrote very important novels that inaugurated a way of making literature in Latin America by breaking the classic molds of linear narration. Hopscotch. Its narrative is essentially fantastic, which is why it is often associated with surrealism, an aesthetic current that was born in Paris and that influenced many artists of all disciplines from the beginning and a bit past the mid-20th century. Julio Cortázar is considered one of the main exponents of the boom Latin American, along with authors such as Mario Vargas Llosa, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Carlos. Among his most famous short story books are Bestiario, End of the Game, or All the Fires They Fire. But Cortázar's storytelling work is much wider. The best thing, if you are interested in reading it, is to get his stories. Pocket has made a budget edition, but there's also one in a slightly larger letter in Alfaguara. In both cases, you'll need to buy 2 volumes. I tell you, Cortázar wrote a lot. Stories. I've taken on the task of analyzing his 2 foundational texts for understanding of the story, those that I quoted at the beginning, with the intention of doing something that not even the runner himself, Cortázar, did, perhaps because he did not propose it: systematize his creative process to the stage, writing stories, but in a practical, perhaps pragmatic way. And I put the emphasis on the practical way because Cortázar indeed set out to systematize his creative process, but he tended to do it in a rather rhetoric, a little complex. Let's say if you've read in the articles, you must have realized that Cortázar, although he tried, was not precisely sure. He pulls a lot from metaphor and analogy to make himself understood, to unravel his own way of conceiving life. Story writing, since I catch you distracted, it's likely that you'll get lost in the attempt to understand. But no one can deny that his way of translating a phenomenon he considered magical is delightful, which is not clear, but that's what geeks like me are for. Nobody asked for it, but I had to do it. For me, for you, for anyone who seeks in the work of cutting, a ray of light that illuminates their understanding of literary creation about a story. Practically all the budding writers I've known, throughout my life, people have spoken to me about Cortázar as if he were a literary oracle will be treated. The influence is undeniable. Especially formal that Cortázar's stories have had on the authors of my generation, like the technique and structure through the stories of Julio Cortázar. Although, if I'm honest, they didn't leave a particularly deep impression on me. Really, so regarding the stories and themes it addresses, in any case, Cortázar's work is of interest, and much to those who are training as literary creators. So I'm going to expose the 5 steps of the creative method that Julio Cortázar used to write stories, with the intention for you to use his method as a reference and contrast it with your own The systematization that I carry out is a work of synthesis and free interpretation of what Cortázar himself exposes in his 2 articles. What I do is arrange and expose in the clearest way I could, even coming out of my own terminology, just as Cortázar exposed in his own way. Cortázar's method as the method that a writer should be his own. In other words, not because Cortázar had this method means that you should have it. There are as many creative methods as there are creators in the world. The point is for you to start to become aware of your own process through the process of one of the greatest storytellers, Hispanic Americans. I'll start by approaching the definition of the story as a genre according to the very definition that Cortázar makes of it, to end with the 5 steps of his method of the creative. But first, take a second to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of the good stuff coming. Let YouTube notify you when it does, when I publish a new video. Ready? Come on, let's go. Over there. Let's start by understanding the vision that Julio Cortázar had about the story. Although I already anticipate that the conceptualization's topic, choice of topic, intensity, tension, and briefly. When trying to define the genre, Cortázar says, I am certain that certain constants exist, certain values that apply to all fantastic or realistic, dramatic or humorous stories. I don't think it's useless to talk about the story in abstract as a literary genre. If we get a convincing idea of this form of literary expression, it can help to establish a scale of values. That's always difficult as ideas tend to the abstract, draining their content, while at the same time the Veda anxiously rejects that bond that conceptualization wants to throw at her to fix and categorize her. It moves in that plane of the eye, where life and the written expression of life fight a fraternal battle, and the result of that battle is the heart itself. The living synthesis at the same time as a synthesized life, a shimmer of water within a glass, a fleetingness in a permanence. The novel and the story can be compared analogically with cinema and photography. While in cinema, as in the novel, the capture of a broader and more uniform reality is achieved through the development of accumulated partial elements, relatives that do not exclude, of course, a summary. That gives the climax of the work in a photograph or account. In high quality, it is done inversely, that is, the photographer or the storyteller sees specified to choose and limit an image or an event that is meaningful, that not only stands on its own, but rather be able to act on the viewer, in the reader, with a kind of opening of ease that projects intelligence and sensitivity towards something that goes beyond the visual or literary anecdote contained in the photo or story. In that fight that unfolds between a passionate text and its reader, the novel always wins by point. While the story must win by knockout, a good story is incisive, biting, simple, in quarters from the beginning, sentences. When it refers to the theme and its choice, Cortázar exposes the significant element of the story. It would seem to reside mainly in its theme, in the fact of choosing a real or fine event that possesses that mysterious property of radiating something beyond itself to the point where it becomes the relentless summary of a certain human condition, or in the symbol of a social or historical order. The subject from which a good story will emerge is always exceptional, attracts a whole system of related relationships, coagulates in the author and later in the reader. A vast number of notions between visions, feelings, and even ideas that virtually floated in his memory or in their sensitivity. They are binders of an infinitely larger reality than that of a mere anecdote. That is why they have influenced us with a force that would not suspect the modesty of their apparent content, the brevity of your text. When we say that a topic is significant, that significance is determined by something that is outside the topic itself. First is the writing, with its load of human and literary values, with its will to create a work that makes sense. when he talks about tension and intensity, Cortázar says, "The idea of significance makes no sense unless we link it with intensity and tension. They no longer refer only to the topic but to the literary treatment of that topic, or to the technique used for development. The only way that momentary kidnapping of the reader can be achieved is through a style based on intensity and tension. What I call intensity in a story consists of the elimination of all intermediate ideas or situations, of all fillers or transition phrases that the novel allows, and requires the abrupt presidency of all environment description, the elimination of everything that does not essentially converge to the drama. The tension, it's an intensity that is exerted in the way the author gradually brings us closer to the story. We are still far from knowing what will happen in detail, and yet we cannot detach ourselves from it. Both the intensity of the action and the internal tension of the story are the product of what I previously called the writer's craft." Well, having a Cortázarian notion of what the story is, let's see what his creative method is for writing stories. In place 1, I choose a topic and from a premise to have a totalitarian forecast of the work right short. There is like a huge cloth total block that is already the story that is very clear, even though nothing could seem darker, and precisely there lies that kind of dreamlike analogy of opposite sign that we are talking about. Composition of a story, since we all have dreamed things that are crystal clear, which once awake will be a story. Clothed in form, a meaningless mass included in the initial plot as the starting point. Taking this step would imply having developed a unique, authentic, and selective vision, what artists have, like mastering the craft in the realm of dramatic construction and narrative techniques. To start with, Cortázar does not consider the possibility that someone can write a story, not at least if it aspires to be so like a story. Professional storyteller, if he does not assume himself like an artist, like a creator. If not, it has defined, recognized his own creative personality, if he has nothing to say about a matter, and if he does not have a mastery of the craft he aims to practice. Almost nothing, right? We must not lose sight that Cortázar began his literary training at a very young age during childhood. And reading and writing from such an early age results in the assimilation of the craft and the development of a perspective, artistic. Does this mean that if you haven't started to train since childhood like Cortázar, you're lost? No, it just means that according to Cortázar's view on the alchemy of the story, those who aspire to write it before pulling themselves together should prepare. For an author in training, this may already seem like a big bump from the start. Return, a blunt refusal that reminds him he is far from reaching his literary. But if you think a little about what Cortázar says, nobody without mastering the craft and having something to say can really write a story. He can try. Another thing is if he achieves it. Before you get into the drama and the thought haunts you, remember that you are wasting your time, because no matter what you do, you'll never become a good writer, considers that Julio Cortázar, or Coco. As his family used to call him, he was a child of bourgeois parents. His father was a diplomat, meaning he lacked nothing and had plenty of support and stimuli type. At 9 years old, due to his frail health, he had already read everything written by Jules Verne, Edgar Allan Poe, and Victor. What were you doing all those 9 years? Do you remember? Does it resemble, even from a distance, the circumstance of the young Cortázar? Calculate how's the thing with the prodigy? That Julito was traumatized when writing his first narrative exercises and sharing them with his mother because she refused to believe that her son was he really the author of those texts because they seemed written by an adult? As an adult, his mother's disbelief bordered the worry. When he consulted the doctor and asked for advice, he prescribed that Julio stopped the reading for at least 6 months and went out to sunbathe, as if that weren't enough. He acquired a professional and higher education as a normal teacher and a literature teacher, so literature was resonating in his head all the time. One of his most famous stories, Casa Tomada, was first published by none other than himself. In 1953, he accepted the offer to translate the complete prose work of Edgar Allan Poe. This work is considered to this day the best translation of the work of the father of the modern story. I wouldn't finish enumerating the many and very interesting relationships that he wove with literati of his time. About to turn 50 years old, after all his childhood and youth dedicated to literature, Cortázar published Hopscotch, the novel that gave him international projection and mounted him on the wave of the Latin American boom, American. Don't be surprised then that the first step of his creative method is to have learning, the mental and totalitarian aspect of the story. 2. Put yourself in the shoes of the characters. Inhabit the sphericity of the story. That is, the universe of fiction in which we live. The characters live, writes Cortázar. The narrative situation itself must be born and occur within the sphere, working from the inside, interior to selection, without the limits of the story being drawn as if modeling a clay spheres. From the short story and its surroundings, Cortázar rescues among all the advice that make up the perfect decalogue, storyteller of Horacio Quiroga, about whom I already spoke in another video. Greetings. A single piece of advice. Narrate as if the story only had interest for the small environment of your characters, of whom you could have been one. The notion of a small environment, says Cortázar, gives its deepest meaning to the concept in defining the closed form of the story, its sphericity. It is convenient to bring here the way in which Cortázar talks about his own method, although do it very shyly and without any intention to delve into what he means It talks about some aspects of the story. The storyteller knows he cannot proceed in a cumulative way. He doesn't have time as an ally. This approach is to work in depth vertically, either upward or downward. The literary space that, when expressed in this way, seems like a metaphor. However, it expresses the essence of the method. Understand what he's referring to. When I was talking about verticality, I took it upon myself to investigate how the expression is usually used and discover that it is said about a person when they have a way of thinking and perceiving reality that often implies order, unaware of the other people, an order in which he places himself and others, furthermore on a top-to-bottom scale. I also discovered that from a psychological perspective, verticality is everything related to a subject's personal history, while horizontality is the current process that is being fulfilled in the here and now in relation to the totality of the members of a group. These discoveries led me to understand that Julio Cortázar referred to in-depth work of the characters vertically upwards or downwards that can also be understood like the chronological linearity to the past or to the future, the only resource of the story. To put it in my own words, it's to navigate along the line that sets up the drama of a character upwards or down in their own history, also considering the stories of other characters who are hierarchically below, which can only be achieved if the author is put on the shoes of their main character and get used to it, to the same universe of fiction as him, or in other words, as if the author himself were the character and lived in his small and limited fictional world. 3. Choose a narrative voice or type of narrator, a technique that keeps us within the sphericity of the body, says Cortázar. When I write a story, I instinctively look for it to be in some way alien to me, as long as it is not an enemy, from my urge, and that the reader has or may have the sensation that in some way he's reading something that is born by itself in itself, and even of itself, in any case with mediation, but never the manifest presence of the demiurge. The sign of a great story is given to me by the fact that the story has detached itself from the author, like a soap bubble from the plaster pipe. Although it may seem paradoxical, first-person narration is the easiest and perhaps best solution to the problem. And the same thing, even when talking about third parties. Whoever does it is part of the action, is in the bubble and not in the pipe. The issue of narrative technique, understanding for this special link in which it is located, the narrator and the narrated, personally that link, it has always been given to me as a polarization. That is, if there is the obvious bridge of a language going from one will to the expression itself. At the same time, that bridge separates me as a writer from the story, as something written to the point that the story always ends with the last word on the opposite shore. In other words, which that worried Cortázar was to remain within the universe of fiction not only through deep characters, but also through a narrative voice or a type of narration. Narrator, not to mean that internal narrators are the only option. I found in them a natural alternative that solved these creative needs. 4. Define the idea of discrete character. That drives to write, says Cortázar. Trying to free oneself from obsessing creatures based on mere narrative technique maybe perhaps give a but missing the essential polarization, the cathartic rejection, the literary result will be precisely that, literary, and let it be formally understood. The story will lack the atmosphere that no stylistic analysis can explain. The aura that pervades the story and will possess the reader as the author had taken possession at the other end of the bridge. The author had to choose a topic, right? A fun. And what's most likely to happen to everything, the author is that he has chosen that theme because initially it is an obsession. Without that obsession, the focus, the chosen theme and the idea that the author has about it can't be polarized in front of the form, the technique, the structure, the interest vested in the topic, but above all the idea that the author has about it, drag them towards creative catharsis. Polarizing in the face of the technique, which implies that to carry out such polarization, the author had to clearly understand what the idea is around the chosen theme, which is what drives him to write in communicative terms. 5. Write as if exorcising the story from oneself so that catharsis determines the effective emergence of tension. Dramatic. What Cortázar is talking about here has something mystical, magical, no? The conjunction of stars whose universes are mind and whose constituent nature are all those elements. As mentioned before, the mystery of the Holy Creation short Ariana, I'm going to read some fragments that in Cortázar's words describes in this last stage, and allow me to do so extensively because it is perhaps the time when the author is best understood in his creative peak, and maybe also because this was the stage that Cortázar was most fascinated by, of which he was able to give a better detail. He exposes. Writing is in some way exorcising, rejecting, invading creators, projecting them to a condition that paradoxically does not exist. It gives them universal existence. Perhaps the most penetrating differential trait is the internal tension of the narrative plot. A tale springs forth like from an act of love, exhausted and out of this world circle, which is slowly returned to with a look of surprise, of slow recognition, often of relief and many times of resignation, for an even more exhausting experience, because on his ability to transfer the obsession depended the return to more tolerable conditions and the tension of the story. It was born from that dazzling elimination of intermediate ideas, preparatory stages, all deliberate literary rhetoric, since there was a stake, an operation, some fatal measure that did not tolerate loss of time. It was there, and only with a swipe could it be torn from the neck or face. That's how I had to write many of my stories, even in some relatively long ones. The omnipresent angst throughout it all. One day, it forced me to work stubbornly until I finished the story, and only then, without bothering to reread it, I went down to the street and walked to nowhere, no longer being any of my characters. This allows us to argue that a certain range of stories comes from a state of trance, normal by the standards of usual normality. There will be no lack of someone who estimates that I exaggerate this notion of an exorbitant state as the only ground where a great short story can be born. I appeal then to my own situation of little story. This man will put a sheet of paper in the machine and start writing even if his bosses and the United Nations retaliate. Full of them fall through the ears. Even if his wife calls him because the soup is cooling down, tremendous things happen in the world. We have to listen to them. Radio broadcasts, or bathing, or phoning friends. I start the reporter block and write something that only then begins to understand. It becomes a coherent story. Invalid, the memory, undoubtedly traumatized by a dizzying experience, keeps in detail the sensations of those moments and allows me to rationalize them here as much as possible. It's now or never, and the fear he can never do exacerbates the time, turns it into a typewriter running at full keyboard. Forgetfulness of the circumstance, abolition of the surrounding, and then the black mass clears up as you move forwards. Amazingly, things are extremely easy. Of extreme ease. We should add here Cortázar's vision about the balance that a story should aspire to. The balance between form and content. I recover the following fragment from some aspects of the story while all the previous ones detached from it. Short story and its surroundings. No matter how expert a story is, if it lacks an endearing motivation, yes. And his stories are not born out of deep experience. His work will not go beyond a mere aesthetic exercise, but the opposite will still be worst because the end is worthless. Fair for the will to convey a message if one lacks the expressive and stylistic tools that make this communication possible. If I had to summarize the Cortázar's process of writing and creating stories, could it be said more or less? We have to put ourselves in the character's shoes, adopt a clear and personal stance on the chosen subject or theme. Choose a type of narrator that includes the author within the universe of fiction and be swept away by necessity. The need to remove the work through catharsis. All of this, starting from the totalitarian forecast of the background and the form of the story, which is nothing more than a shapeless clot. Dark but in the hands of the storyteller who knows and masters his craft is the perfect breeding ground. In 1983, after the return to democracy in Argentina, Cortázar made a final trip to his homeland where he was received with victims. People would stop him on the street, they would ask him for autographs, in contrast to the indifference of the national authorities. Carol Dunlop, his second wife, she passed away at the end of 1982, plunging Cortázar into depression, pressure. On February 12, 1984, due to leukemia, Cortázar passed away in 2012. In 2001, Uruguayan writer Cristina Perirossi, who was a very close friend of Julio Cortázar, stated in her book, Julio Cortázar and Chris, that the leukemia had been caused by AIDS, virus that Cortázar would have supposedly contracted during a blood transfusion in discomfort. Let's remember that the HIV pandemic had its greatest impact from the second half of the 80s to the first half of the 90s. The 90s, and as happened with many victims of the virus at that time, and as still happens today, the stigma and prejudice surrounding the disease pushed Cortázar and his immediate circle to disguise, or let's say hide, the disease that ended the environment with his life. Although none of this, of course, is relevant now as we approach his work with admiration and enthusiasm, right? So let's celebrate the work of one of the most influential Latin American authors, and let's be enlightened by his vision, the story. Who better than him, who wrote great stories and who was, so to speak, a disciple of the very father of the modern story? No, Edgar Allan Poe. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Like the video and share it. Also subscribe to my website newsletter. Go to israelpintor.com with a bulletin bar and fill in the background. What did you think of the Cortázar method? Do you find in him a clear reference that allows you to understand his own creative method? The vision that Cortázar had about the story has helped you understand the way you... Do you understand the genre? Leave me a comment sharing your impressions. I will read them all. I am Israel Pintor, literary coach and creative writing workshop teacher. Write because life is short and blockages happen. Bye.
Sígueme en Instagram. Diseñé un montón de filtros para escritores en apuros. Podrás cotillarme de cerca. ¿Quieres tomar clases conmigo? Conoce mis cursos en israelpintor.com.